Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is risk calculation. And the risk calculation is basically the process of identifying the likelihood of a threat, the impact from the threat, and then how quickly our systems can become operational again. All right, so the likelihood is, as the name implies, how likely is that threat? All right, is the vulnerability likely to be exploited? The other thing is the AIL or the ALE, and that's the annual loss expectancy. And basically, how much do I expect to lose throughout the year if I combine my single loss expectancy and my annualized rate of occurrence? Okay, we'll cover this in more detail in just a moment. All right, but that's basically the total amount that I expect to lose throughout the year. And there's a algorithm or a kind of a formula that's applied to get to that value. The impact is, as the name implies, it's the impact of having that threat actually exploited. Okay, so is it downtime? Is it complete loss of data? Is it loss of customer confidence? It just depends upon what the asset is. All right, so the single loss expectancy, or the SLE, as the name implies again, is how much will that single loss, if that threat is actually exploited, how much will I expect to lose on that single occurrence? And then the annualized rate of occurrence is how often do I actually expect that to be successfully exploited throughout the year. All right, so we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But just understand that these things are kind of combined to give us a formula on how much we can expect to lose throughout the year. And then a few other terms I want to be familiar with, or make sure that you're familiar with, are MTTR, the mean time to recovery or the mean time to repair, depending upon where you read, the mean time to failure, and the mean time between failures. So the likelihood of the threat is the possibility of the threat initiation. Okay, and that's what I talked about just a moment ago. It can be ranked qualitatively or quantitatively, and I'll talk about those terms in just a moment as well. Just because a vulnerability exists doesn't mean that it can necessarily be exploited. So that's what I was talking about before. If it's an internal system that can't be reached from the outside world, then some type of external facing threat we don't really necessarily need to be concerned with. All right, so we may or may not want to actually take the time and effort to patch that. All right, so I just want to make sure you're aware that understanding the risk enables proper prioritization. Everything cannot be the highest priority, and everything obviously can't be the lowest priority. So we have to really rank our likelihoods and our threats so that we can remediate those things appropriately. Okay, the next thing is the impact of the threat. If the threat is successfully initiated, then what's the impact? Could it be systems are slow and unresponsive or completely offline? Does it mean data loss? Does it mean destruction of systems or data? Customer confidence, downstream effects, etc., etc. So downstream effects meaning if one system goes offline, does that then affect 5 other applications or 5 other systems? And does it have dependencies that can create a much bigger outage than just the threat itself? All right, so all of these things have to be kind of planned, and that's why it's very important to do planned maintenance versus unplanned outages. Okay, so here we talk about qualitative analysis versus quantitative. So a qualitative analysis is an assessment that assigns a numerical value to the probability of a risk and the impact it can have on the system or network. The point to take away here is that no monetary value is assigned for our assets or the possible losses when we're talking about qualitative analysis. All right, so basically, as an example, we would assess a risk of not installing, let's say, for instance, an antivirus application on our end user systems. And we would range that or give it a range from, let's say, 1 to 100. And that range is arbitrary. Okay, we can assign it whatever number scale we want. For this example, let's just go 1 to 100. So the probability of risk of infection at some point, if it's an outwardly facing system, again, if people have access to the internet, the probability of risk is, let's just say, 99. The amount of impact, we'll rank that at an 80. Again, arbitrary, because there's a 20% chance that our systems would still be functional even if we caught a virus, right, or a piece of malware or whatever. So we may be able to actually still do some work, but it's going to be significantly slowed down. Our ability to get things done is going to be impeded, right? So we'll give it a ranking of 80. So if we multiply that 99 times 80, that gives us a ranking of 7920 or 7,920 out of a possible 10,000, right? Because if we took our 1 to 100, both of those categories would have a maximum value of 100. So if we took 100 times 100, that would give us 10,000. So that's where we get the 7920 out of 10,000. So that's on the high end. Okay, it's in the top, really the top quarter of or the top 25% of risk. So that's, relatively speaking, it's a high risk impact. Now, the flip side of that is a quantitative analysis. Now, quantitative, as I mentioned, it actually assigns an exact monetary value to assets, and then attempts to give expected yearly loss in dollars for any given risk. So What that does is allows us to prioritize based upon the financial losses to be incurred versus the cost of protecting. All right. So as an example, and it's basically comes down to a business decision. But if we said we have 10 systems and it's going to cost us, let's just, hypothetically speaking, cost $1 million to put antivirus on those 10 systems. All right. Obviously, it's not going to cost that much, but just for this example. All right. So it costs us $1 million to protect them, and the systems themselves only cost whatever, $1,000 or $1,500 a piece, and they only do very minimal amount of work. And if they all basically were compromised and went down, it would cost us maybe $30,000 or $40,000 in damages. Well, it's not worth spending $1 million to protect $30,000. All right, so in that instance, we could say the financial loss is not as great as the cost of protecting. All right, so some loss calculation terms that we use to calculate some of these things, as I mentioned before, are the annual loss expectancy, or the ALE, okay, the monetary measure of how much loss you can expect in 1 year. The single loss expectancy, or the SLE, is the monetary measure of how much you can expect to lose at any one time. All right, so single loss. So that's calculated by the value of the asset by the exposure factor, okay, AV times EF. And then we have the annualized rate of occurrence, or the ARO. That, again, gets back to the likelihood. And that's usually determined with historical value of an event occurring within a year. So we're going to go back and look, okay, what's the realistic number? How many times did we get hit with this last year, or the last 2 years, or the last 5 years? Okay, you look at some type of historical kind of trending, so you get an idea of what's the likelihood I'm actually going to be hit with this specific either vulnerability is going to be exploited, or I'm going to have some type of threat. And then when you do that, you basically times the SLE times the ARO, or the single loss expectancy, times the annualized rate of occurrence, and that's going to give you your annual loss expectancy. All right, so as an example, let's say we have an e-commerce company that generates $100,000 in sales per hour from their website. All right, I wish I had that company, right? So the probability of the server failing during the year is 30%. Now, obviously, if it's a highly functioning e-commerce site, it's not going to have a single server, but it's going to have a server cluster, load balancing, all those types of things. But for our example, okay, just play along for a moment. Let's just make it easy to calculate. So the probability of that server failing during the year is 30%. The failure would generate 4 hours of downtime and $6,000 in components to repair. Okay, we may have to put in new hard drives, maybe a new motherboard, a new power supply, what have you. So it's going to cost us 4 hours of downtime plus $6,000 in components. So the SLE, the single loss event, or expectancy rather, is $406,000, right? $100,000 per hour, because we're going to be down for 4 hours, plus the $6,000 in repair, okay, for the parts and so forth. So our ARO is determined to be 30%, 0.30, because we said the probability of the server failing during the year is 30%. So that's our ARO. Okay, so if we then calculate the ALE, or the annual loss expectancy, is going to be $121,800. That's how much we can expect to lose each year, or this year. We can expect to lose $121,000 because we have our $406,000, which is the single loss expectancy, times the actual annualized rate of occurrence. So what's the likelihood of that happening?